Hi, this is Peter Perry, and today we're going to be talking about postcolonial criticism, a primer for biblical studies. And the first question we need to ask is, what is power? Power is everywhere. It's embodied, it's enacted, it's not something that you possess as an individual. What this means is that power is relational, that power is influence embodied and lived out by people, groups, institutions, and nations. You can't avoid power. If you are in a relationship with another person, power is flowing like electricity for good or for ill. So if power is relational, that means it's granted by one person and exercised by another. Power is yielded, it is not taken. And this is an important point because we often think of power that is taken, but if a person does not yield power, it cannot be taken. Power is not something that is intrinsic to one party, but power is deployed in order that one party may try to distinguish what is good or bad, true or false. Let's focus on that for a moment. To assert truth, then, is to deploy power in a relationship. And the questions we need to ask are, who is the relationship between? And why is one person yielding to another person's definition of what truth is? And why is that person using that power, that influence over the other to assert what truth is? And what are the effects on both the person speaking about truth and the person who is trusting it? We need to be sure that we're clear here, that we're not talking about relativism. We're trying to analyze how human beings use the concept of truth in relationships. And how do we as Christians, as Christ followers, think of power? Well, the first way is that we think about power as yielding to God all the power. For example, in the book of Revelation, the 24 elders fall before the one seated on the throne. They worship the one who lives forever and always. They throw down their crowns before the throne. Christ followers are called to deploy power that others yield to them in order to serve God and to serve neighbor as ourselves. So Jesus called his disciples over and said, "You know that the ones who are considered the rulers by the Gentiles show off their authority over them, and their high-ranking officials order them around, but that's not the way it will be with you. Whoever wants to be great among you will be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you will be slave of all." Let's talk about the dynamics of power. First off, we should note that information is power. And when we give information to another person, we are yielding power. And when we read in the Bible or other texts that information is given, we should interpret that as yielding of power. When a secret is revealed, when financial or health records are shared, this is a yielding of power. Representing yourself or other people is an exercise in power. And we do this on Facebook, where we exercise a representation of ourselves, and others may try to represent us by using fake videos. And this shapes a public perception of our identity. Power is more profound when people do not realize they're yielding power. This is what makes a post on Facebook that then is manipulated and spread to be more surprising. And this leads to the concept that power flows are amplified when hidden, that when it's not clear that power is being yielded or exercised, that power is actually intensified or strengthened. We think when we're signing up for Facebook, then we enter our birth date and other personal information, that that's just normal, and everybody does that as a part of using it. But it is a hidden transfer of power that intensifies Facebook's control and influence over us. Now we want to describe 5 different kinds of power in order to understand the complexity of power relationships. First, there is charismatic power, which is the influence of someone who is thought by others to be charismatic over individuals or groups. Now again, this is still a yielding of power. A group of people perceive a certain person to be charismatic, and so they yield power consciously or subconsciously. An example of this is Billy Graham, who was very highly thought of by other Christians, and so much power was yielded to him. The second kind of power is social power, a loose, unofficial influence of a person or a group in a particular society. This is when a group has a kind of common identity and they are more willing to yield power because of that common identity. An example of this is the title evangelical Christian will often encourage people to yield power to those who carry the same label. The third kind of power is institutional power, and this is power that a group of people grant to one person based upon institutional decisions, the office or position within that organization. An example of this is, of course, a pastor who has been granted power by the organization because of their office. Another kind of power is economic power, which is the influence that comes from controlling resources or means of production. And so, for example, if Google calls a city, usually they take that phone call. Although it would be so interesting to analyze right now why New York seemed to turn down Google. But nonetheless, Google exerts enormous economic power because of their control of internet resources. Fifth kind of power is governmental power. And this is a kind of institutional power, but it is a state power held and often exerted with the threat of violence. For example, the Roman Empire has a certain power and institutional power that's backed by its military. Or King Herod has thugs and militia that do his will and back up his influence. We need to have a word about violence. That violence is itself not power, and here we define violence as the destruction of life, health, or property. And the threat of violence may be used in any of the above relationships as a means of power. For example, the Roman Empire uses the threat of violence in order to suppress rebellions and encourage people to yield power to it. So now to talk about postcolonial studies. This is the analysis of culture after the end of a colonial power. For example, the end of British rule of Palestine, which was detailed in a 1978 book by Edward Said called Orientalism. And this book, Orientalism, for many is the beginning of postcolonial studies. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. The case that is important for us, and we will look into in some depth, is the colonization of India and the post-colonial studies of India that has been done by biblical scholar Sugata Raja. But to go back and look at the beginning, the Portuguese began the colonization of India as early as 1505 by building trading centers, and then sending military to conquer cities and build forts. They began settling by encouraging soldiers to marry local girls, and in 1661 formed an alliance with England. And besides politically dominating and economically exploiting and settling, the Portuguese also started the spread of Christianity at the same time, and Christianity became intermingled with political domination and economic exploitation. The Dutch became involved in India in 1616, but the English East India Company overtook them greatly in 1720. The spice trade is why all of them were there. Black pepper, cinnamon, cassia cloves, nutmeg, pomander, cardamom, ginger were the reasons that they were trying to exploit India and control it politically, even religiously. We shouldn't forget that America was discovered by accident by Christopher Columbus, who was looking for a quicker route to India. He was trying to get rich from the spice trade. To summarize, there's a threefold oppression: the exploitation of workers and natural resources by trading companies that move goods towards an imperial center. There's violence and threats of violence by garrison military forces, and Christianity is promoted by missionaries as a triumphant superior faith. And we should note that this is a heresy. Remember that Jesus said that he came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. We should note that even before Britain officially had control over India, the East India Company had a private army of 260,000 before. William Joyce and Hicks in 1928 said, "We conquered India by the sword, and by the sword we will hold it." I am not such a hypocrite to say we hold India for the Indians. This is hegemony, referring to the dominance of the colonizer over the colonized, trying to make the yielding of power invisible, the social power, the economic power, institutional power, governmental power. And in all of these, we need to understand religious aspects are intermingled in hegemony. In each of these, representation is one of the key ways that a colonizer controls the colonized. It aids domination, silences dissenting voices, and centralizes power. For example, see how Winston Churchill represents Indians in this quote. "I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion. Let the viceroy sit on the back of a giant elephant and trample Gandhi into the dirt." Representation has real-world effects on people. London ate India's bread while India starved. In 1943, nearly 4 million Bengalis died, and Winston Churchill said it was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. Think of the ways other people are represented that you're aware of. For example, take this quote from Edward Said in his book Orientalism, describing how some Westerners thought of Arabs. Arabs, for example, are thought of as camel-riding, terroristic, hook-nosed venal lechers whose undeserved wealth is an affront to real civilization. Always there lurks the assumption that although the Western consumer belongs to a numerical minority, he is entitled either to own or to expend, or both, the majority of the world's resources. Why? Because he, unlike the Oriental, is a true human being. One of the key aspects of postcolonial criticism is to examine how people are represented and to what extent they are dehumanized or made to be represented as other. Another aspect of postcolonial criticism is the analysis of centers and margins, that colonialism creates a physical, economic, and social geography with a center and a margin. Maps are one of the primary ways this is visualized, but we can also see this center and margin through economic infrastructure, such as ports, terminals, and shipping routes, social infrastructure, such as armies, bureaucracies, laws, guilds, schools, and history, and ideology and religion that support the maintenance of the center and the transfer of power from margins to the center. Consider this map of the world. Notice what's at the pictorial center of the world, but Great Britain, at the time the imperial power. Maps create boundaries and establish ownership that, of course, don't always match the flow of people and nature and creation. Images are used to reinforce hegemony, to promote the yielding of power from one group of people to another, and to hide that flow of power as completely natural and appropriate. In this way, images and ideas are used to create another who is not completely human. For example, in this newspaper art, a man is shown like a wild beast, a Hindu fanatic after human sacrifice. How could this person be anyone we could ever relate to? Through these ideas and images, a totalizing discourse claims to be the absolute truth, that people are essentially one way or the other, and thus creating an us versus them dichotomy that supports the yielding of power in one direction and the exercise of power in the other direction. Both the colonizer and the colonized begins to believe that this is reality, that this is the way things have always been, that this is the natural order of things. It's the total of reality. These claims for the totality of reality spreads to every aspect: language, economic theory, labels, news, history, art, ideas, in each representing the dominant culture as superior over the other. This other is called a subaltern, literally meaning a space of difference. This is the single homogeneous other represented by the hegemonic power. For example, when we speak of the third world, we lump millions and millions of different people together in one group. The strong speak for the weak. Well, those weak people can't speak for themselves. We have to speak for them, and in this way they are silenced. They need superiors to make decisions. And all of these kind of totalizing discourses create an other who is silent and powerless and seems to just naturally need to yield power. Now, post-colonialism is many different things, and if you get 10 people practicing post-colonialism, some may call it decolonialism, and almost all of them will disagree. But at its best, post-colonialism wants to do these things: demolish the representations of the colonial system that dehumanizes and silences, decentralize the economic, social, and ideological geography that minimizes the lives and humanities of people, demonstrate the falsity of totalizing and essentializing discourses that represent and attempt to silence subalterns, and to propose new directions that enhance the lives of marginalized peoples, to describe subaltern voices and experience, to give voice to language, economics, history, and art and ideas that have been silenced. What this means for biblical post-colonial criticism is that it cuts two ways for each dimension of the analysis we've been learning. On one hand, for the subaltern, whose voice has been silenced, and on the other hand, against the text. For example, when we're analyzing the world behind the text, we want to describe subaltern voices and experiences that are part of the situation behind the text. And at the same time, we have to describe how the text was produced in and may have reinforced hegemonic discourse. This can be uncomfortable for us to admit, to confess, and yet, if we are trusting in forgiveness and are humble before our Lord, we can do this. And when we're examining the world inside the text, the world of the text, we're looking to uncover the subaltern voices and experiences and God's action on behalf of the subaltern. And we also want to describe how the text may reinscribe hegemonic discourses. When we're looking at the world in front of the text, we describe how the text has been and can be used to decolonize and free us, and at the same time describe how a text has been used to colonize and reinforce colonial assumptions and discourses. This is not an easy process, and I look forward to our conversations and your questions and concerns as we explore this biblical post-colonial criticism. Thank you and God bless.